The morning of October 17, 2026, began in Steyning, West Sussex, much like any other. Sir Olaf Caroe, a former British governor of the northwest frontier, awoke in his armchair to discover he had slept past his own century and into a world where the region he once administered was unrecognizable. For centuries, Pashtuns governed themselves through Pukhtunwali, a strict, ancient code of honor older than Islam. It was a culture defined by independence, rich poetry, and a non-negotiable obligation to provide shelter to anyone who asked. But today, the sky falls on those same mountains. Commercial drones rigged with explosives drop without warning on family compounds and crowded markets. This diagram tracks the devastation over a single 12-month period between 2025 and 2026. Terrorist outfits launched 444 drone attacks across the region, killing nearly 500 people, with North Waziristan bearing the heaviest concentration of civilian casualties. The violence is physically trapped. A militarized steel fence, lined with watchtowers and landmines, now slices directly through ancestral grazing lands, severing families living on both sides for generations. The nightmare consuming the Pashtuns is the result of three distinct geopolitical injections forced into their homeland by outside empires. The first injection arrived with the British. To 19th century imperial strategists, the Pashtun homeland was a disposable geographic buffer, used only to keep Russian expansion away from the approaches to South Asia. This math shows the 1893 Duran Line. Slicing through tribal territories, this arbitrary border followed realpolitik to keep the population divided. But to the Pashtuns, the line was a meaningless fiction. Families married, traded, and fought across it, treating British ink as a temporary obstacle. The mapmakers left a permanent scar. Decades after the British left, Cold War governments inherited the same logic, utilizing these mountain passes merely as a strategic choke point against the Soviet Union. This era established a fatal precedent. Global powers commodified the Pashtun people into a living barricade, prioritizing strategic geography over human sovereignty. The second injection came in the 1980s. To bleed the Soviets in Afghanistan, the CIA and Pakistan's military dictator, Zia-ul-Haq, funneled billions of dollars into manufacturing a factory of holy war on the frontier. Militants weaponized the Pashtun code itself. Knowing that local honor demanded providing shelter to any guest, fighters hid in civilian homes, inevitably drawing devastating military night raids down upon innocent families. They corrupted the tribal duty of revenge. Every father killed by a stray bullet or brother lost to a drone strike became a blood debt, and radical factions offered grieving survivors the weapons to collect it. Traditional tribal elders and community councils were eliminated. In their place, foreign intelligence money built thousands of religious schools, teaching a rootless extremism that had nothing to do with mountain traditions. The second injection perverted faith and honor. Acts like suicide, explicitly forbidding in traditional Islam, were celebrated, mutating a code built for community survival into an engine for global terror. The third injection was an unforeseen consequence of 20 years of Western state building. This period trained a new class of Afghan technocrats who were intensely territorial and deeply hostile to Pakistan. When the Taliban swept back into power in 2021, they faced a logistical crisis. They knew how to wage war, but not how to run ministries. To survive, they absorbed the technocrats into their government. This created a dangerous hybrid regime. You now have a Taliban that enforces brutal religious doctrine while deploying modern diplomacy to demand the return of occupied Pashtun lands across the border. This vengeful territorialism stands in stark contrast to the mid-20th century, when leaders like Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan campaigned for Pashtun rights through nonviolent resistance alongside Gandhi. Today, those peaceful ambitions are dead. Civilians are crushed in a kinetic war zone, caught between an oppressive fundamentalist regime and a heavily mined fence. The ultimate tragedy is that the Pashtuns' defining virtues, their courage and fierce independence, were the exact traits that marked them for exploitation. Because they were skilled warriors, they were constantly recruited to fight other people's battles. A century of continuous proxy warfare has erased their history. A young man born in Waziristan today has never known a day without conflict. He cannot read the poetry of his ancestors. He knows only the rifle and the command to fight. The landscape reflects that emptiness. Schools sit shuttered, clinics are abandoned. An entire generation has been stripped of its economic future, leaving young men with few options outside the violent economy of the militias. They have been betrayed by the British, by the intelligence agencies that armed them, by the foreign militaries that bombed them, and by their own radicalized leaders. Yet, despite it all, the language survives, and the people remain standing. The bleeding on the frontier will continue as long as global superpowers view the Pashtuns as a geopolitical weapon. Peace requires the maps of empire to be burned, leaving them alone to simply be humans.
Chapter 1. The Awakening. The morning of October 17th, 2026 began as mornings had always begun in the quiet Sussex countryside. Mist drifted across the valley below Steyning in slow white ribbons. A solitary robin perched upon the weathered garden gate, tilting its head as if listening to sounds inaudible to the human ear. Beyond the trees, the South Downs rose in gentle green folds beneath a pale autumn sky, unchanged by wars, revolutions, or the passing of empires. The first rays of sunlight touched the chalk hills exactly as they had done for centuries. Newham House stood in silence. Its grey Victorian walls bore the marks of rain and wind accumulated over more than 100 years. Ivy climbed patiently along the western face of the house. The rose bushes, planted decades earlier by Olaf Caroe and his wife Frances, had grown into tangled walls of branches and faded blossoms, pressing gently against the windows as though trying to look inside. Nothing seemed disturbed. It was as if time itself had paused. Inside the drawing room, an elderly man opened his eyes. For several moments, he simply sat. The room was familiar, yet strangely distant, like a place remembered from childhood. He looked slowly around him. The Persian carpet, the walnut bookshelf, the brass clock above the fireplace, the portrait of Frances. Everything remained exactly where memory insisted it should be. Except the fire. The hearth was cold, not merely extinguished, but anciently cold. Grey ash lay undisturbed beneath the grate. No warmth lingered in the room. It seemed impossible that anyone had lit the fire for years. Olaf Caroe frowned. I must have slept longer than I intended. His own voice sounded unfamiliar. He reached for his watch. It had stopped. He wound it carefully. Nothing happened. A curious feeling passed through him, not fear, but uncertainty. He stood slowly. Age still accompanied him. His knees protested. His shoulders were stiff. Yet there was no illness, no dizziness, no weakness beyond that of an old man. He walked toward the kitchen. Everything appeared precisely where it belonged. The kettle rested on the stove. The tea caddy remained beside it. Even the porcelain cup he preferred seemed to be waiting for him. He filled the kettle. Water flowed immediately. The gas ignited with a clean, blue flame. While the kettle boiled, he found himself looking out through the kitchen window. The garden had become wilder. The apple tree had grown broader. The hedges were higher. Nature had continued its quiet work while someone, or something, had forgotten to inform him. He poured the tea. The familiar ritual steadied his thoughts. Whatever had happened, tea remained tea. He carried the cup into the sitting room and stood watching the mist dissolve beneath the strengthening sun. Only after finishing did he notice what was missing. His old wireless, the large wooden BBC receiver that had accompanied so many evenings, had disappeared. Instead, upon a nearby table rested two unfamiliar radios. One bore Cyrillic lettering. He turned it over in his hands. A Soviet receiver. That surprised him. Beside it lay a remarkably small Sony portable set, unlike anything he remembered seeing. He smiled faintly. The Japanese have been busy. He switched it on. Static, then music, then a calm English voice. This is the BBC World Service. Relief washed over him. Some things endured. He adjusted the tuning. The announcer continued. Today's developments in Ukraine. Ukraine? He frowned. Continuing discussions on artificial intelligence? Artificial intelligence? The humanitarian situation in Afghanistan remains severe as the Taliban government. His hand froze upon the dial. Taliban? The name meant nothing to him. He listened. One bulletin followed another. China, the European Union, satellite navigation, climate change, the internet, mobile telephones, space stations, digital currencies, pandemics. Each report seemed less comprehensible than the last. He assumed at first that he had accidentally found some speculative broadcast, a program imagining the future. But the voices were entirely matter of fact. No drama, no fantasy, simply the news. At last came the weather forecast. Sunday, the 17th of October, 2026. The room became perfectly still. Caroe looked again at the calendar lying upon the writing desk. October, 17th, 18. He read it several times, then quietly placed it back where he had found it. No expression crossed his face. Throughout his career, he had cultivated the habit of postponing judgment until sufficient evidence had been assembled. Emotion could wait, facts first. He spent the entire day listening. Every hour confirmed the same impossible conclusion. Queen Elizabeth II was dead. The Soviet Union no longer existed. The British Empire had vanished from the map. India and Pakistan had fought wars. Afghanistan had been invaded by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union itself had collapsed. The United States had invaded Afghanistan. The Taliban ruled Kabul once more. He found no explanation for how he had awakened. Nor did he seek one. There are moments in life when the mystery itself becomes less important than its consequences. Toward evening, he walked into his study. The familiar scent of old paper met him at once. Here, at least, he expected certainty. His own books stood where he had left them. The Pathans, Wells of Power, Soviet Empire, the works of Elphinstone, Burns, Masson, Edwards, Curzon, Bellew, Rafferty, Vignes. Their worn bindings seemed like the faces of old companions, yet they were no longer alone. Entire shelves had appeared where none had existed before. Hundreds of books, perhaps thousands, modern bindings, university presses, government archives, military histories, memoirs, anthologies, collections of diplomatic papers. Titles caught his eye: The Soviet-Afghan War, Ghost Wars, Taliban, Pakistan, A Hard Country. Directorate S, The Great Game Revisited, Afghanistan since 1979, The Fragmentation of Pashtun Society, The War on Terror, Drone Warfare, books written long after his own death. Someone, or something, had assembled an impossible library. He removed one volume almost at random. Its first chapter began with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979. He sat. Outside, darkness settled over Sussex. The robin had long since disappeared. Inside, only the green-shaded reading lamp illuminated the room. He read until midnight, then until dawn. For days he scarcely left the library. He read dispatches, military histories, intelligence memoirs, academic monographs, Pakistani newspapers, Afghan testimonies, United Nations reports. He read not as a politician defending opinions, but as a historian reconstructing events. Slowly, decade by decade, an immense pattern emerged. The Soviet invasion, the jihad, American covert operations, Saudi money, the madrasas, the Civil War, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, September 11th, the American invasion, 20 years of war, the return of the Taliban, violence spreading across both sides of the Durand Line. Each book answered one question while raising another. Weeks became months. The study table disappeared beneath maps of the frontier. Photographs accumulated beside handwritten notes. The names that had once belonged to distant districts under British administration returned with terrible familiarity. Khyber, Kurram, Bajour, Momand, North Waziristan, South Waziristan, Banu, Kohat, Peshawar, Swat, places he had once known as living societies now appeared repeatedly in chapters devoted to insurgency, displacement, terrorism, and military operations. Late one evening, he closed another volume and leaned back. For the first time since his awakening, emotion overcame discipline. He walked slowly to the window. The Sussex night was silent. Far above, the stars shone with complete indifference. He found himself thinking not of England, but of another evening many decades earlier, watching the sunset beyond the mountains of the frontier. He remembered laughter inside a hujra, old men debating genealogy, young men reciting Kushal Khan Katak, children running between mud walls, the smell of green tea, the sound of a rabab. He had believed that world ancient enough to survive any empire. Now he was no longer certain. He returned to his desk. His eyes rested upon a single sentence he had copied from one of his own books many years before. History rarely ends where its authors imagine. For a long time he stared at those words. Then, almost reluctantly, he opened a fresh notebook. Across the first page he wrote, in the neat hand of an Indian civil service officer trained in another century, the Pathans. A final chapter. The frontier. Since 1953. He paused. Outside, the first light of another autumn morning touched the Sussex Downs. Inside the old house, Olaf Caroe dipped his pen into ink and, for the second time in his life, began to write the history of the people he had never truly ceased to love. Chapter 2. The Library of the Dead. For the next several weeks, Olaf Caroe ceased to exist for the outside world. Had anyone passed Newham House, they would have seen nothing unusual. A lamp burned late into the night in the study. An old man occasionally walked among the rose bushes before returning indoors. The post remained untouched. The telephone never rang. The village below continued its quiet rhythm, unaware that one of Britain's most distinguished students of the northwest frontier had, by some inexplicable providence, returned to life. His entire existence narrowed to a single room, the library. When Caroe had last entered it in November 1981, it contained the accumulated learning of a lifetime. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Mount Stuart Elphinstone stood beside Alexander Burns, Charles Masson beside Godfrey Thomas Vinyar, Herbert Edwards beside Sir Henry Lawrence, Curzon, Rafferty, Bellew, Holdick, Oliver, all the familiar companions who had shaped his understanding of the frontier. Now those old voices had acquired successors. Books published after his death filled shelves that had never existed before. University dissertations, government archives, memoirs of soldiers, diplomats, intelligence officers, aid workers, journalists, anthropologists, and Afghan refugees. There were volumes written in Britain, Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, the United States, Russia, France, Germany, and Japan. Histories whose authors had been children or not yet born when he himself had died. He smiled faintly. History, he murmured, never ceases writing itself. He approached the collection as he always had, methodically, not chronologically, but genealogically. Every event had parents, Every catastrophe possessed ancestors. He began where his own life had ended, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The books disagreed on details but agreed on essentials. In December 1979, Soviet troops crossed the Amu Darya, assassinated Hafizullah Amin, installed Babrak Karmal, and attempted to preserve a communist government already collapsing beneath rebellion. Caroe understood immediately. For nearly 2 centuries, British statesmen had feared precisely this possibility. Not communism, which belonged to another age, but Russian armies moving southward toward the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. The actors had changed. The geography had not. He reached for a notebook. Across the page he wrote, "The great game did not end. It merely acquired new players." He read on. The Soviet Union expected a swift intervention. Instead, it encountered a society unlike any in Europe. Mountain tribes, ancient loyalties, independent valleys, a people whose history had taught them endurance beyond calculation. The Red Army possessed tanks, aircraft, helicopters, artillery, and one of the largest military establishments on Earth. Yet none of these proved decisive. Villages destroyed in one season produced new resistance in the next. Each military victory seemed to generate political defeat. Caroe nodded slowly. Alexander had learned this. The Mughals had learned it. The British had learned it. Now the Soviets were learning it. Then another story began to unfold. American money, Saudi money, Pakistani organisation, weapons flowing across the frontier, training camps, madrasas, volunteers arriving from throughout the Muslim world. The resistance became something far larger than a national uprising. It became an international cause. He paused. Here the books multiplied. American authors celebrated freedom. Russian authors described terrorism. Pakistani writers praised jihad. Afghan writers mourned their country. Each possessed fragments of truth. None possessed the whole. He continued reading. Weeks passed. His notebook filled. One observation returned repeatedly. Throughout the 19th century, Britain had sought stability. Throughout the 20th century, every external power sought mobilization. That difference troubled him. The frontier he had administered had certainly been imperfect. There had been raids, feuds, rebellions, and punitive expeditions. Yet the object of British policy, however paternalistic or self-interested, had usually been to limit violence, to contain it within tribal custom, to prevent local conflict from becoming continental war. Now, the opposite seemed true. Violence itself had become strategy. The frontier had ceased to be merely defended. It had become weaponized. The thought unsettled him. One rainy afternoon, he removed a volume devoted to Pakistan during the 1980s. There he encountered a transformation he had never anticipated. The political agent, the Malik, the Jirga, the Hudra, institutions that had endured for generations. One after another they weakened, some disappeared. Others were deliberately attacked. The tribal elder no longer commanded unquestioned authority. The village guest house ceased to be the centre of public discussion. The Jirga lost influence before men carrying automatic rifles and claiming religious certainty. He read testimonies from old Pashtuns. Many spoke not first of bombings or battles. They spoke instead of silence. The silence after music disappeared. The silence after poets stopped reciting. The silence after neighbours became afraid of one another. Caroe closed the book. For several minutes, he stared through the rain-covered window. This was not merely war. It was the slow dismantling of a civilization. The next shelves dealt with the 1990s. Here confusion reigned. The Soviet Union collapsed. Afghanistan did not recover. Victory dissolved into civil war. Former allies became enemies. Cities were shelled, villages emptied, roads once travelled by merchants filled instead with armed convoys. Then came a name he scarcely recognised: the Taliban. He searched every available volume. At first, they appeared almost accidentally. Religious students, young men from refugee camps, products of displacement, children who had grown up knowing war but little peace. Children whose earliest memories were helicopters, artillery, refugee tents, and religious schools. No generation before them had inherited such a world. He wrote quietly beneath another note: "Wars educate as surely as schools." Days later, he reached September 2001. He read every official report he could find: the destruction of the World Trade Center, the attack upon the Pentagon, the collapse of towers before a watching world. Then came the American invasion. Again, the armies of a great power entered Afghanistan. Again, they achieved astonishing military success. Again, they struggled to achieve political peace. 20 years passed beneath his eyes in little more than 2 weeks. Generals changed, presidents changed, strategies changed. The war remained. Then came August 2021. The Americans departed. The Taliban returned. Caroe put the book down, very carefully, very gently, as though sudden movement might somehow alter what he had read. It did not. That evening, he left the library for the first time in several days. The autumn air carried the scent of damp earth. The downs glowed beneath the setting sun. Children's voices drifted faintly from the village below. He watched them without seeing them. His thoughts remained thousands of miles away. He remembered riding through the Khyber in the 1930s. Old Afridi tribesmen greeting him with measured courtesy. Maliks arguing over grazing rights. Young boys racing horses through dusty valleys. He remembered believing those mountains almost timeless. Now he wondered whether timelessness had merely been an illusion created by one peaceful generation. When darkness fell, he returned to his desk. He spread before him 2 maps. One depicted the frontier as he had known it: political agencies, settled districts, roads, mountain passes. The second showed modern Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Afghanistan. It contained not merely roads, but military bases, refugee camps, drone strike locations, militant strongholds, checkpoints, fences, and zones of insurgency. He compared them in silence. At length, he whispered words no one else could hear. "The mountains remain." He paused. "But the society that gave them meaning has been terribly wounded." It was the first conclusion he allowed himself to write, not as an administrator, nor as an imperial strategist, nor even as a historian. It was the conclusion of an old man mourning a people he had spent his life trying to understand. He dipped his pen into ink. Across a fresh page he wrote the title of the next chapter: The Last Imperial Mind, 1953 to 1981. Then, before beginning, he looked once more toward the dark Sussex hills. For the first time since his impossible awakening, he felt a weight he had never known during his years in government. Not guilt alone, not sorrow alone, but the uneasy realization that ideas conceived in one age can outlive their authors, passing from empire to nation, from nation to superpower, acquiring purposes never imagined by those who first gave them life. Chapter 3. The Last Imperial Mind, 1953 to 1981. When I laid down my pen in 1953 after completing the Pathans, I believed I had written not merely the history of a people, but the history of one of Asia's oldest frontiers. I did not imagine that I had written only the end of one age. History, however, is rarely so courteous. It closes no chapters. It merely turns pages. Looking back now, with the advantage of knowledge that no man was meant to possess, I understand that my generation belonged to the last generation of the British Empire. We had inherited an immense political tradition stretching from Clive and Wellesley to Lawrence, Curzon and Minto. We believed that empires, whatever their faults, existed to preserve order in regions where order was fragile. We spoke of administration, frontiers, communications, irrigation, tribal settlement and political balance. We did not think ourselves philosophers. Still less did we imagine ourselves the authors of future catastrophes. We believed we were practical men. Perhaps that was our greatest illusion. I first crossed the frontier as a young officer of the Indian Civil Service. Nothing in England had prepared me for it. Europe was a continent of fields, villages and states. The frontier belonged to another civilization. There, the mountains governed politics more completely than kings. A tribe occupied one valley. Its rivals occupied the next. Every pass possessed a history. Every spring had witnessed a battle. Every family remembered genealogies reaching back centuries. The authority of governments weakened with every mile one travelled away from Peshawar. The authority of custom never weakened. That custom was older than any administration. Long before Islam reached these mountains, long before Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush, long before the Persians established satrapies in Gandhara, there existed among these highlands a fierce attachment to honour, independence and tribal autonomy. Empires came, empires departed, the tribes remained. Many Englishmen misunderstood the Pathans. Some regarded them as little better than brigands. Others romanticised them as natural warriors untouched by civilization. Both views were mistaken. The Pathans possessed civilization. It was simply not organised like our own. Its parliament was the jirga. Its public house was the hujra. Its police were reputation and honour. Its constitution was Pukhtunwali. One could disagree with its judgments, one could criticise its customs, but one could not deny its remarkable capacity to govern difficult country without large bureaucracies or standing armies. I admired that achievement. Indeed, I admired it more as the years passed. Yet, admiration is not innocence. During my years in government, another reality always stood before us: Russia. For nearly 2 centuries, British policy in Asia revolved around a single question: would Russia descend through Central Asia toward India? Every Governor-General confronted that possibility. Every Viceroy inherited it. Every political officer understood it. It shaped maps. It shaped diplomacy. It shaped budgets. It shaped careers. The frontier therefore possessed significance far beyond the tribes themselves. It became the hinge upon which imperial security appeared to turn. To London, the Khyber Pass was not merely a mountain road. It was one of the gates of India. Should a hostile empire ever pass through it, the consequences might extend across an entire continent. That fear coloured everything, even when it was not spoken aloud. It was within this intellectual climate that I developed many of my own conclusions. Looking back now, I recognise both their strengths and their limitations. I argued repeatedly that the Pathans possessed qualities unmatched elsewhere upon the frontier. They were hardy, disciplined within their own customs, magnificent soldiers when properly led, accustomed to mountain warfare, naturally resistant to foreign domination. In another age, these observations appeared obvious. Indeed, they were shared by many administrators before me. Had Russia advanced southward, these same tribes might well have formed the first barrier against invasion. The reasoning appeared sound. It belonged entirely to the strategic world in which I had been educated. I never imagined another world. When India was partitioned in 1947, the British Empire withdrew with astonishing speed. The transfer of power occurred more rapidly than almost anyone had expected. One flag descended. Two flags rose. Pakistan inherited the northwest frontier. India inherited the responsibilities of the plains. Britain departed. Many believed the great game had ended. I was not among them. Empires disappear. Geography remains. The mountains remained. The passes remained. Russia remained. Only the names upon official letterheads had changed. Pakistan interested me greatly. It was a new state attempting to inherit one of the most difficult frontiers in Asia. Its soldiers had served beside British soldiers. Its administrators had learned within British institutions. Its problems, therefore, resembled those we ourselves had once faced. Would the tribal system endure? Would Kabul accept the Durand Line? Would Soviet influence grow? Would the frontier remain stable? These questions occupied my thoughts throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Each passing year seemed only to increase their importance. During those decades, Afghanistan remained outwardly peaceful. King Zahir Shah governed cautiously. He avoided reckless adventures. He balanced foreign powers with considerable skill. Yet, beneath the surface, another struggle unfolded. Roads built by one superpower, airfields financed by another, military academies receiving Soviet advisors, development programs sponsored by the West. Afghanistan had become neutral. But neutrality itself attracted competition. The great game had changed its costume. Its actors no longer wore Victorian uniforms. In 1973, the first great shock arrived. Mohammed Daoud Khan overthrew his cousin, King Zahir Shah. The monarchy disappeared. For the first time in centuries, Afghanistan became a republic. Daoud revived the question of Pashtunistan, demanding self-determination for the Pashtuns living inside Pakistan. Old arguments returned wearing modern language. Borders once negotiated between empires became subjects of nationalist politics. The temperature along the frontier began slowly to rise. I watched with concern. Yet I still believed events remained within the realm of ordinary diplomacy. 5 years later came the event that truly disturbed me. The Saw Revolution. Communist officers seized Kabul. President Daoud was killed. Marxist ideology, imported from Europe, attempted to transform one of Asia's most traditional societies. Land reform, political purges, attacks upon tribal authority, restrictions upon religion. The program struck directly at every institution that had long sustained Afghan society. Resistance spread rapidly. It did not surprise me. Revolutionary theories rarely survive first contact with mountain tribes. Then came December 1979. The Soviet army crossed the frontier. For nearly 2 centuries, British strategists had imagined this possibility. Now it had occurred. Not against British India, against Afghanistan. The old nightmare had become modern reality. I remember reading the first reports, columns of tanks, airborne troops, special forces, a change of government imposed by foreign arms. For a moment, history seemed almost circular. The empire had changed, the geography had not. I wondered whether the Soviet leaders understood the country into which they had marched. I suspected they did not. My own health had already begun to fail. Age imposes its own frontier. I followed the early stages of the conflict closely. The resistance grew. Villages fought. Tribes mobilized. The Soviets discovered, as so many armies had discovered before them, that occupying Afghanistan and governing Afghanistan were profoundly different undertakings. I believed the war might continue for years. I did not live long enough to discover how right that judgment would prove. I died in 1981, believing that I understood the strategic problem. Russia had advanced, Afghanistan resisted, the world would respond. What followed, I imagined, would resemble earlier contests between great powers. I could not have been more mistaken, for I belonged to the 19th century in my habits of thought. I still imagined wars fought principally by armies, states negotiating with states, empires pursuing interests through diplomacy supported by force. I had not foreseen that ideology would become a weapon greater than artillery, nor that religion could be mobilized upon an international scale, nor that intelligence agencies would recruit armies invisible upon any official order of battle, nor that a frontier once governed by tribal custom would become the meeting place of global revolution, militant religion, covert warfare, and modern technology. Above all, I had failed to imagine that the people whose courage I had admired would themselves become the battlefield. As I looked back across those years from the impossible vantage point of 2026, one realization refused to leave me. I had written of the Pathans as a people. Governments after me increasingly spoke of them as an asset, a resource, a buffer, a strategic depth, a proxy, different words, the same mistake. Once a people ceases to be regarded as an end in themselves and becomes merely an instrument of policy, history begins quietly preparing a tragedy. I did not yet know how complete that tragedy would become. The books waiting upon the shelves would soon teach me, and when they did, I would discover that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was not the climax of the story. It was only the opening act. Chapter 4. The Inheritance of an Idea, 1979 to 1989. There are moments in history when an idea escapes the control of the man who first conceived it. It leaves the study in which it was written. It passes from one generation to another. Each generation reshapes it according to its own fears, ambitions, and necessities until, at last, it bears little resemblance to its original form. So it was with the frontier. When I served the government of India, we regarded the northwest frontier not as a battlefield but as a shield. It was the outer wall of the Indian subcontinent. Our concern was defensive. Whatever our faults, and they were many, we wished above all to prevent a great war from reaching the plains of India. The tribal belt was to absorb pressure, not generate it. Stability, however imperfect, remained the objective. After 1947, the empire disappeared. The map changed. The assumptions did not. Pakistan inherited not only the frontier, but much of the strategic thinking that had accompanied it. Its military academies studied British campaigns. Its administrators inherited British files. Its officers learned the geography, the tribal structure, and the old calculations concerning the Khyber, the Kurram, the Toki, the Gomal, and the Bolan. History rarely hands nations a blank sheet of paper. More often, it hands them the notes of their predecessors. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan transformed those inherited ideas. For Pakistan, the danger appeared immediate. A hostile superpower now stood upon its western frontier. To the north lay Soviet Central Asia. To the east stood India. The memory of 1971, the loss of East Pakistan and the birth of Bangladesh, was still painfully fresh. Pakistan's rulers believed they could not afford another strategic defeat. General Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq, who had seized power in 1977, viewed the Soviet advance through precisely this lens. Washington reached a similar conclusion. For the United States, Afghanistan became the principal battlefield of the Cold War. President Jimmy Carter authorized assistance to the Afghan resistance. Under President Ronald Reagan, that assistance expanded dramatically. The Central Intelligence Agency launched one of the largest covert operations in modern history. Saudi Arabia matched much of the American funding. Egypt, China, Britain, and several other states contributed weapons or training. The world converged upon the frontier, not with armies alone, with money, with intelligence services, with ideology, with faith. As I worked through memoirs, declassified documents, and diplomatic correspondence, I became aware of something that no one in 1981 could yet have fully perceived. Every participant believed he was fighting a limited war. The Americans believed they were bleeding the Soviet Union. The Pakistanis believed they were protecting their western frontier. The Saudis believed they were defending Islam against atheistic communism. The Afghan resistance believed it was fighting for national survival. The Soviets believed they were preserving a friendly government. Each believed the struggle had a clear objective. None foresaw what their combined actions would create. Millions of Afghans crossed into Pakistan. Refugee camps stretched from Chitral to Shaman. Around Peshawar, entire cities of tents appeared almost overnight. Children were born who had never seen the villages from which their parents had fled. They knew only exile. Their schools were often improvised. Their fathers were absent. Some fought. Some had died. Some would never return. For the first time in centuries, displacement became the normal condition of an entire generation of Pashtuns. No empire, not Alexander, not Genghis Khan, not the Mughals, not the British, had produced refugee populations on such a scale among the Pashtuns. This alone should have warned the world that something unprecedented was taking place. Yet another transformation was occurring, quieter but ultimately more profound. The old authority of the Malik weakened. For generations, the Malik had served as mediator between tribe and government. He possessed influence because his authority rested upon kinship, reputation, and the decisions of the Jirga. Now another authority emerged, the militant commander. His power rested not upon age or tribal consensus, but upon weapons, money, and ideology. Alongside him stood the religious teacher, whose influence reached beyond tribe and genealogy. The mosque increasingly overshadowed the hujra. The commander overshadowed the elder. The rifle overshadowed the council. These changes unfolded gradually, almost imperceptibly, but they altered the social foundations of the frontier. The hujra had always fascinated me. Many foreigners misunderstood it. They imagined it merely a guest house. It was far more. It was parliament, club, school, court, and hostel combined. Travellers rested there. Poets recited there. Young men learned manners there. Disputes were discussed there long before they reached the Jirga. Politics itself possessed a human scale. Now, as I read the testimonies collected decades after my death, I found repeated references to abandoned hujras. Some stood empty because their owners had fled, others because gatherings had become dangerous. Still others because militants regarded such places with suspicion. Conversation gave way to command. Hospitality yielded to fear. The loss seemed almost invisible beside the destruction of cities. Yet civilizations often perish first in their ordinary habits. Music too became a casualty. I remembered evenings when the soft notes of the rabab drifted across village courtyards. The songs celebrated love, honour, exile, and the poetry of Kushal Khan Khattak and Rahman Baba. No government had organised these traditions. No ministry had preserved them. They endured because ordinary people cherished them. The books before me described musicians silenced by intimidation, instruments destroyed, public performances abandoned. Such acts did not merely suppress entertainment, they severed memory. A people deprived of its songs soon forgets part of its soul. Then came another realization. Throughout history, the Pashtuns had certainly fought. Indeed, they had acquired a formidable military reputation. but traditionally they fought for tribe, valley, honor, ruler, or homeland. The conflict now assumed a different language. Increasingly, young men were encouraged to think not as members of particular tribes, but as participants in a universal ideological struggle. This was something new. The old code of Pukhtunwali did not disappear. It became intertwined with ideas originating far beyond the mountains. The result was often confusion. Ancient customs and modern ideologies merged into forms neither wholly traditional nor wholly modern. Future generations would inherit that confusion. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union itself had begun to weaken. Its economy faltered. Its authority across Eastern Europe crumbled. In February 1989, the last Soviet troops crossed back over the Amu Darya. The invasion had failed. Around the world, many celebrated. Victory appeared complete. Yet, as I continued reading, I noticed a curious silence. Everyone discussed how the war had ended. Few asked what kind of society remained after 10 years of continuous conflict. Villages lay in ruins. Roads were mined. Schools had disappeared. Millions remained refugees. Weapons were everywhere. An entire generation had grown up amid violence. No strategic victory could erase such consequences. Wars end on maps long before they end within human beings. Late one evening, I returned to my earliest notes written after my awakening. I found a sentence copied from the Pathans. The strength of the frontier lay less in its mountains than in the character of its people. I read it several times. Then I added another sentence beneath it. The greatest tragedy of the late 20th century was not that the mountains became a battlefield. It was that the people themselves gradually became instruments in the strategies of others. I laid down my pen. Outside, rain fell softly across the Sussex Downs. Inside, another realization slowly took shape. The Soviet withdrawal was not the conclusion of the tragedy. It merely removed one actor from the stage. The play itself had only reached its interval. The most terrible scenes were still to come. The books waiting on the shelf bore a single name: The Taliban. Chapter 5. The Orphans of Victory, 1989 to 2001. History has often shown that victory can be more dangerous than defeat. Nations prepare themselves for war. They mobilize armies, raise taxes, manufacture weapons, and steel themselves for sacrifice. Far fewer prepare themselves for victory. When the common enemy disappears, the passions that had united men frequently turn inward. Allies become rivals, rivalries become wars, and triumph gives birth to tragedy. So it was in Afghanistan. When the last Soviet soldier crossed the Amu Darya on February 15, 1989, the world declared that the Afghan resistance had prevailed. In Washington, the war was celebrated as one of the decisive victories of the Cold War. In Moscow, it was remembered as a costly humiliation. In Pakistan, there was satisfaction that the western frontier had escaped Soviet domination. But among the mountains of Afghanistan, there was little celebration. There was exhaustion. Entire provinces lay in ruins. Irrigation channels had been destroyed. Orchards that had sustained families for generations had withered beneath shellfire. Roads were broken, schools deserted, hospitals scarcely functioning. More than 5 million Afghans remained refugees in Pakistan and Iran. Millions more wandered within their own country, strangers in landscapes they had once called home. The Soviet army departed. The devastation remained. As I turned the pages of memoirs written by Afghans themselves, I encountered a recurring observation. The greatest wound was not physical, it was social. The old balance of Afghan life had been shattered. Before the war, authority had rested upon several pillars: the tribe, the village, the jirga, the malik, the mullah, the monarch. No single institution possessed absolute authority. Each limited the others. It was an imperfect equilibrium, yet it had endured for generations. War destroyed that balance. Men who commanded armed groups now possessed influence greater than tribal elders. Foreign money strengthened some factions while weakening others. The language of negotiation slowly yielded to the language of force. Power increasingly flowed from the barrel of a rifle rather than from the respect of one's neighbours. Pakistan, too, had changed. During the struggle against the Soviet Union, it had become the indispensable bridge between the outside world and the Afghan resistance. Refugee camps, training centres, intelligence networks, supply routes, diplomatic missions, charitable organisations, all converged upon Peshawar. The ancient city became the unofficial capital of the Afghan war. Its hotels housed journalists. Its bazaars sold goods from every corner of Asia. Its streets echoed with dozens of languages. Yet beneath this extraordinary activity, another transformation was taking place. A generation of young Afghans was growing up outside Afghanistan. Many had never seen the villages from which their fathers had fled. Their memories consisted of refugee camps, relief agencies, religious schools, and stories of a homeland they scarcely knew. They inherited a country through memory rather than experience. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 altered the international landscape with astonishing speed. For nearly half a century, the rivalry between Washington and Moscow had defined world politics. Now one of those rivals vanished. The Cold War ended. Strategic attention shifted elsewhere. Afghanistan, having served its purpose in the calculations of great powers, gradually disappeared from the front pages of newspapers. But history does not cease merely because the cameras depart. The Afghans remained. So did their weapons. So did their divisions. The communist government in Kabul, deprived of Soviet support, survived longer than many expected. President Mohammad Najibullah attempted reconciliation, yet his government rested upon foundations already weakened beyond repair. In 1992, Kabul fell. Many observers expected peace. Instead, they witnessed a new war. The factions that had fought together against the Soviets now turned their guns upon one another. The capital became the battlefield. Neighbourhood fought neighbourhood. Commander fought commander. Artillery that had once been directed against foreign soldiers now destroyed Afghan homes. Thousands perished. The city that had long been one of Central Asia's most graceful capitals became a landscape of shattered buildings. I lingered over photographs of Kabul before the wars. Tree-lined avenues, universities, bookshops, gardens, women and men walking together through the streets. Then I examined photographs taken only a few years later. The same streets reduced to rubble, libraries burned, museums looted, families living among ruins. No conqueror from abroad had accomplished this. Afghans had done it to themselves. This realization saddened me more deeply than I expected. It was while studying this period that another name began appearing with increasing frequency: the Taliban. At first, the references were brief. Students from religious schools, young men from refugee communities, volunteers determined to restore order where warlords had failed. Many Afghans initially welcomed them. After years of lawlessness, almost any promise of security possessed enormous appeal. Caravans could travel again. Banditry diminished in areas under their control. Roads reopened. Corruption was punished swiftly. To a population exhausted by chaos, these developments seemed miraculous. History repeatedly teaches that disorder often prepares the way for uncompromising authority. Yet the movement contained contradictions from the beginning. Its leadership consisted largely of men formed by war rather than by civil administration. Many had spent their formative years in refugee camps or religious schools. Their understanding of society reflected those experiences. The Afghanistan they sought to build differed profoundly from the Afghanistan remembered by older generations. Its vision was narrower, its interpretation of religion more rigid, its tolerance for diversity markedly reduced. As the movement expanded, these characteristics became increasingly visible. In September 1996, Kabul fell once more. The Taliban entered the capital. Former President Najibullah, who had lived for years within the compound of the United Nations, was seized and brutally executed. His body was displayed publicly. The image travelled around the world. It announced that a new chapter in Afghan history had begun. The new rulers promised peace. They also imposed severe restrictions upon daily life. Women disappeared from many professions. Girls' education was sharply curtailed. Music was prohibited. Television vanished. Public punishments returned. The state sought to regulate private conduct with unprecedented intensity. As I reflected upon these developments, I found myself thinking once more of Pukhtunwali. The code I had admired throughout my career had never been gentle. It valued courage, it demanded honour, it accepted revenge, yet it also prized hospitality, consultation, and local autonomy. The authority of the jirga rested upon discussion rather than decree. The Taliban represented something different. Their legitimacy derived not from tribal consensus, but from religious certainty. The distinction was fundamental. A society governed by consultation differs profoundly from one governed by unquestionable interpretation. Many outsiders failed to appreciate this difference. Some imagined the Taliban simply represented traditional Pashtun culture. The evidence suggested otherwise. They had emerged from a society transformed by exile, prolonged conflict, ideological struggle, and institutional collapse. They were not merely heirs of the old frontier. They were also children of the 20th century's greatest geopolitical conflict. The destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas in March 2001 struck me with particular force. For 15 centuries, those colossal figures had watched silently over the valley. They had survived the Arab conquests. They had survived Genghis Khan. They had survived Timur. They had survived the Mughal Empire. They had survived British influence. They had survived modern nationalism. Yet they did not survive the new Afghanistan. Their demolition symbolized something larger than the loss of 2 statues. It reflected a rupture with history itself. A civilization confident in its identity rarely fears the monuments of earlier ages. Only insecurity demands their destruction. As the century drew toward its close, another figure entered the narrative: Osama bin Laden. His presence within Afghanistan gradually transformed what had been largely a regional conflict into a matter of global concern. Training camps multiplied. Foreign volunteers arrived. The ambitions of militant organizations extended far beyond the Hindu Kush. The world, which had largely ignored Afghanistan after the Soviet withdrawal, began once more to pay attention. But it was paying attention too late. I closed the final volume shortly before midnight. The room was silent. Rain tapped gently against the windows of Newham House. I walked to the shelves where my own copy of the Pathans rested. I removed it carefully. Between its pages lay a pressed flower, forgotten for more than 40 years. Perhaps Francis had placed it there. Perhaps I had. I could no longer remember. Memory itself becomes selective with age. Holding the book in my hands, I found myself asking a question that had never occurred to me during my lifetime. Had we, in all our strategic calculations, sufficiently understood what prolonged war would do to the soul of a people. We had studied tribes. We had measured mountain passes. We had calculated supply routes. We had analysed empires. But had we truly understood the cumulative effect of 20 years of uninterrupted violence upon children born into exile, educated amid conflict, and coming of age knowing nothing except war? I feared we had not. No imperial memorandum could have measured such things. No military dispatch could have predicted them. Yet history would be shaped by them more profoundly than by any campaign. I returned the Pathans to its shelf. Then I reached for the next volume. Its title needed no explanation. Ghost Wars. The chapter awaiting me bore a date already engraved upon the memory of the modern world. September 11th, 2001. Chapter 6. The Long War. 2001 to 2021. The 20th century ended, many historians have remarked, not on December 31st, 1999, but on the morning of September 11th, 2001. Watching the records of that day unfold before me, I understood why. For the second time in little more than 20 years, Afghanistan became the centre of world history. The first time, the armies of the Soviet Union had marched into the country. The second time, the world came because men who had found sanctuary in Afghanistan struck at the greatest power of the age. The names of New York and Washington instantly became linked with Kabul, Kandahar, Jalalabad, Tora Bora, and the mountain valleys of eastern Afghanistan. The geography of the frontier had once again drawn an empire toward it. History had completed another circle. When I first served on the frontier, older officers often repeated a simple observation. Afghanistan is easy to enter. It is difficult to govern. Alexander entered. The Arabs entered. The Mongols entered. The Persians entered. The British entered. The Soviets entered. Now the Americans entered. Each arrived with different motives. Each possessed different weapons. Each believed its own age had solved problems that had defeated previous generations. The mountains received them all with equal indifference. The American campaign began with astonishing speed. Within weeks, Taliban positions collapsed. The Northern Alliance advanced. Kabul fell. The Taliban government disappeared. Many observers concluded that the war had effectively ended. I knew enough history to distrust such optimism. The conquest of capitals has often been mistaken for the conquest of countries. Afghanistan has never been governed solely from Kabul. Its true political geography lies in valleys, tribes, districts, loyalties, and local understandings accumulated over centuries. Governments that fail to understand this often discover that victory on the map conceals uncertainty upon the ground. The books surrounding me described the first years after the invasion with considerable hope. Schools reopened. Universities admitted women once again. Roads were repaired. Hospitals expanded. Millions of refugees returned. International organizations poured billions of dollars into reconstruction. A new constitution was drafted. Elections were held. Foreign diplomats spoke confidently of democracy, development, and nation building. Reading these accounts, I wish sincerely that they had proved correct. Yet another collection of books, written only a few years later, painted a darker picture. The Taliban had not disappeared. They had retreated. Some crossed into Pakistan. Others returned quietly to their villages. Still others simply waited. The Americans measured success in months. The Taliban measured time in generations. Here again, I recognized an old feature of frontier politics. Mountain societies possess a patience unfamiliar to industrial civilizations. Harvests teach patience. Winters teach patience. Tribal memory teaches patience. The calendar of the village differs greatly from the calendar of distant capitals. By the middle of the decade, violence had begun to spread once more. Improvised explosive devices, suicide bombings, ambushes, night attacks, assassinations, roadside mines. The language of war itself had changed. The great cavalry charges and frontier expeditions of my own era